favorite things to do since I started on my path to ministry is to ask people how they became Unitarian Universalists. As a result, I have met many lifelong UUs who have so many rich stories and family traditions to share. And of course, I've met all manner of transfers or adopters or joiners who often have drastically different stories to share. We, as a faith, are a very interesting blend of people. People who truly know their UU roots and have been UUs for generations, and others who later in life find themselves rooted in Unitarian Universalism. Because of our diversity, it can be challenging to be in a room of UUs, and it is even more challenging to preach to a room of UUs, knowing that there are a variety of beliefs staring back at me. But one thing I've heard that we need to surely not blindly accept is this statement: UUs can believe anything.
Oh.
That's not actually accurate. While we have no creed, we do. Living into our principles can be tough sometimes, but I'm reminded of Rumi's line, "Though you or I have broken my vows 1,000 times, come, yet again come." And so even when I make one too many lefty comments, or I personally get a little bit judgy, I still return and return again to not just the roots of this faith that I love, but the root by which I found it, and the root by which it came to be. Unitarianism and Universalism both emerged from a giant dose of divergent thinking. And in the 500 years that followed, we invited more divergent thinkers into our fold. Perhaps that is why today we may very well be the most open and accepting religion out there. Many other houses of worship and religions and spiritualities are open and affirming, to be sure. But we have the distinct honor of being so open that we have theists and non-theists, Buddhists and Jews, Muslims and humanists, pagans, Wiccans, religious naturalists. We are a soup. And that is one of our toughest growing edges. How to respect the beliefs of every member of the soup, especially if we don't agree with them. Come, yet again, come. I was compelled to dig deeply into UU history as part of my credentialing process. I had to read over 100 books after seminary, and it's pretty fascinating stuff. So again, join me on the 27th for UU 101. And I'm grateful for Tom for giving you a crash course in our Universalist roots. I particularly liked your joke about New Jersey, but we'll talk about that later. What I really want to talk about today, though, are some key moments in UU history that were, for lack of a better word, conflictual, and which, through that tension, created something new and promising. But not always. Sometimes the tension led to conflicts that lingered for years and are still lingering. In all cases, Unitarian Universalism is a story of the aforementioned growing edges. And I am choosing to frame it this way because of the opportunity it affords each of us to examine our own growing edges in our individual journeys to becoming UUs, or religious people in general. I'd like us to consider the parts of our personal spiritual journeys that mirror the tensions that help to define and shape our denomination. Throughout our history, there have been both Unitarians and Universalists who were divergent thinkers who disagreed with the dominant religious paradigm and had the courage of their convictions to stand up for their beliefs. We saw a picture earlier. In the 1500s, although there were non-Trinitarians for far earlier than that, Unitarians believed that God was one. Thus, they rejected the Trinity and Jesus' divinity. Needless to say, they were not liked. Our first martyr, as we saw the picture, Michael Servetus, was brought to the stake by none other than John Calvin and burned in 1553. Servetus refused to recant his Unitarian belief and was killed for being a heretic. And he grounded all his work in Scripture, by the way. He was no slouch. At around the same time, the Universalists openly disagreed with the notion of preferred salvation. They believed that all were saved because that was the true sign of a loving God. They too were not that popular. Remember, at that time, the Catholic Church was incredibly powerful and there was enough unrest going on with that pesky Protestant Reformation. So just looking at these two origin stories alone, I wonder how many of us sitting in this room and in our religious upbringings, you or other, had those moments where what we were being told or taught did not connect with what our spirit was telling us. How did we react? Did you push back? Did you study some more? Did you stand up for what you thought was truth? Did you change your minds? Did you, like me, flee our religion of origin in search of a faith or theology or cosmology that better aligned with what our heart, mind, spirit was telling us? I imagine that our route to these seats is probably riddled with these disconnects, with questions that were never answered, and maybe even some kind of conversion story, like we heard James Luther Adams in Wonder Box. I imagine many of us had a moment in our lives when we examined our roots, saw the tension, felt the conflict, and decided to take a different path. And that's what makes our faith so interesting. It is filled with all these characters who over the past 500 years, or even just 200 or so on this side of the pond, who had these conversion moments that turned out to be the growing edges of our faith. Some were rethinking what they'd always been taught. Some were actively rebelling against teachings and structures and practices that were exclusionary or did not align with what they felt was the divine presence. Still others were looking for ways to reconcile new ways of knowing and perceiving the divine with that which came before. And as a result, we have this rich belief system that is an amalgam of things rejected and things incorporated. Last year at my internship congregation, I was able to lead a small group ministry using the curriculum What Moves Us, developed by Reverend Sandeka. The course is primarily focused on the conversion stories, or what I called in my research many years ago, epiphanic experiences. And they're all about the conversion experiences of key figures in both Unitarianism and Universalism. So many of our influencers, to use a pop culture term, our founding men and women had epiphanies around theology, divinity, the nature of the cosmos, and how humans embodied religious, moral, and ethical standards. So I ask again, how many of us have pondered these same questions and found that feeling of dissatisfaction? Something wasn't quite right. How many of us have had an experience where something catches and we understand the big questions in a whole new way? These stories abound, and I will highlight only a couple because we would be here for hours if I wanted to go through, well, more than a few of them. And I'm going to talk about both positive and negative aspects of these individuals and their stories because we can learn from both of them. So I start with the powerful preacher Theodore Parker, who used to pack them in. I mean, standing room only, and like 3,000 people in a room, right? Over, like spilling out of the room. Okay. His, at the time, deemed lefty politics and controversial sermons caused quite a stir among Unitarians. At the time, in addition to having a free pulpit, many ministers would exchange pulpits, like swap Sunday services, as it were. And when Parker put too much zeal into his abolition work and his divergent ideas, many other ministers refused to swap with him, which I think is powerful. Maybe it's a feather in his cap. Parker was a staunch abolitionist and reportedly kept a shotgun next to his desk in case anyone attempted to re-abduct a former slave. And maybe one of his most famous quotes still guides you today. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." We owe a lot to Parker And I wonder if anyone here has a particular issue that they feel so strongly about that that's why they keep coming back. Parker, though, was not without his, issues, as it were. His largest growing edge, in my humble opinion, was the accent on individualism. But he was just supporting the dominant American paradigm at the time. And of course, he wasn't alone. This sense of individualism was also supported by another significant influencer, Henry David Thoreau. For us outdoor lovers, having Thoreau on our UU team is quite a boon. He taught us that nature holds the power to teach and transform us if only we'd give her the time. And when his pal, Ralph Waldo Emerson, delivered his divinity school address at Harvard, heads exploded. God found in nature? What? We, mere mortals, can have a direct connection to God? I guess he was trying to put people like me out of business, but more importantly, though, while certainly very individualistic in nature, he was, Emerson that is, was reminding us that our relationship to the divine was ours. We didn't need scripture or priests to mediate it for us. Now this one particularly resonates for me on my spiritual journey, and I mostly learned it when I started hanging out with some Quakers. So how about you? Where on your journey did you discover that you could connect with the divine or a higher power or your better angel or your whatever you want to call it? Somewhere on your path. Our history of individualism may be one of our toughest growing edges. Are spiritual journeys really meant to be solitary? Should we really be putting ourselves before others on this path? All the time? Some of the time? I guess what I'm wondering is how do we get to beloved community if we're really focused on my journey, my roots, my path? As the theme of this year's General Assembly was, we need to shift ourselves from the I to the power of we. But our history has not completely set us up for that. So it's going to be a challenge. But did your roots set you up for that? And does something on your journey teach you to shift from the I to the we? Is that what helps you live into this covenantal community? Many social theorists attribute this individualism to patriarchy, and I can't say that I disagree. Thankfully, unlike many other faith traditions, or at least recorded histories of dominant faith traditions, both Unitarians and Universalists gave voice to women. We were not always great at it. We limited women's access to seminary, but we do have a feather in our cap, and I know that Tom brought it up last week too. The Universalists ordained the first woman in any denomination in 1863. And her name was Olympia Brown. Now, to get personal, as a devoutly religious Catholic girl when I was younger, I never really realized that there were no women in leadership roles until I was 17. And I met, I think she was a Methodist, at our Catholic retreat weekend. And I'm going to say this out loud even though it's terribly embarrassing. I walked up to her and she said she was, I don't know if she used the word priest or minister, and my response was, but you're a woman. And I think my face probably looked like that when I said it. And she said, yeah, I am. And that was a huge shift for me. I went home, my parents like, did you know that women can be ministers? What? Anyway, I digress. So I really feel like the reason I get to stand here today and live into this calling is thanks to Olympia Brown and the Universalists who decided to listen to her voice. Anyone else in the room relate with that? Sorry, skipping a page. Wow, I decided to rely on technology and
paper.
I learned my lesson last time. Okay. Now, in the interest of time, but I assure you this won't be the last time I take us on an exploration of UU history, I want to point out a few more growing edges, and I ask you to notice how they resonate with you. In the early 20th century, humanism began to grow within Unitarianism. Reverends Dietrich and Rees both preached that people were the rulers of their own affairs, and there is no supernatural authority whose approval they had to gain. What a shift that ushered in. Removing a supernatural force, or we're talking about God, started the humanist-theist controversy in our faith that still sometimes shows up today. But humanism was not an all-out rejection of God, but rather the incorporation of, or a reminder that, reason and scientific thinking are key ways of knowing, and that when we happen upon new information, we have to address it and reconcile it. But nowhere in that history is, I'm right, you're wrong. And I think we have to remember that, because we do have theists and non-theists in this room, and that is part of our history. Come, yet again, come. Two other growing edges that are important to consider have to do with how the Unitarians in particular deal with race and class. I will address class on the 20th, and a discussion of race in the Unitarian context is a sermon in itself, which I'm sure I'll eventually make. But I really want to tell you the story briefly about one of the pictures that we had of Egbert Ethelrod Brown, a Jamaican man and a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who really discovered that while he was sitting in the seats of the AME church, he was a Unitarian. And he tried to attend Meadville Seminary, which was the most prominent Unitarian seminary, and he was told, quote, white churches need white ministers. But he actually persevered and was eventually ordained in 1912. He had a church first in Jamaica and then in Harlem for almost 40 years. I'm sure most of us have not even heard of this fellow, right? Okay. And his journey was one of deep struggle, like getting financial support and then having it taken away and having to risk his whole family, and right? There's a lot more that I can say about him, but I want to bring it up that we are full of inconsistencies. We had an abolitionist, a shotgun-loaded abolitionist in Parker, and yet then we had a denomination that wouldn't support someone who really wanted to be a Unitarian minister because they were a black man. Right? We are not without that kind of conflict and tension. We have an ingrained racism, and it's something we've been working on. It's created tensions numerous times over the years, and in some ways it still remains unresolved. So I ask us, when we say, come, come, whoever you are, do we really mean it? Have we made progress on this particular growing edge? Have we made progress on our personal journey? Our UU history is rich, our roots are many, as are our journeys. And I encourage you to reflect on how you got here, how we got here, and how knowing our past can lead us into the future together. May we find time to reflect on our origins. May we examine our personal journeys to understand ourselves better. May we use that understanding to be open to one another so that we can learn and grow. May it be so.